Live closed captioning is available. Please click on the CC icon and select View Subtitle. Welcome to today's event, Anti-Racist and Community-Centered Research Approaches for a More Just and Equitable Society. The University of Michigan is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land transfer to the University of Michigan. This was offered ceremonially as a gift through the treaty at the foot of the rapids. Through these words of acknowledgement, their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and their contributions to the university are renewed and reaffirmed. My name is Mary Rose, and I'm the Anti-Racism Collaborative Program Manager here at the National Center for Institutional Diversity, or NCID. The Anti-Racism Collaborative is a strategic space that works in conjunction with NCID's Diversity Scholars Network to facilitate engagement among the University of Michigan community around research and scholarship focused on racial inequality, racial justice, and anti-racist praxis. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few reminders with you all. Again, live closed captioning is available. Please click on the CC icon and select View Subtitle. The session is being recorded and will be available on the NCID website following this session. A transcript will be provided on the website with the event recording. Please submit questions using the Q&A tool in your Zoom toolbar. Engage this topic online with the hashtag NCID Anti-Racism and follow us on Twitter at UMichNCID. Please help us build this and other anti-racism collaborative and diversity scholars network programming by completing our post-event survey displaying in your browser immediately after the discussion ends. More information about NCID's Anti-Racism Collaborative is available on our website. The Anti-Racism Collaborative is part of a multifaceted initiative launched by the Provost Office that supports and expands the university's scholarly work in anti-racism and addresses culture and climate concerns on campus. We're pleased to have Provost Susan Collins join us today to offer opening remarks. In addition to serving as the university's Chief Academic and Budget Officer, she holds faculty appointments in the Ford School of Public Policy and the Department of Economics. Her scholarly work focuses on understanding and improving living standards in countries at all levels of development. Provost Collins will be followed by our panel moderator, Dr. Tabby Chavis. Dr. Chavis is Director of NCID, Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, and Professor of Education and Psychology. Please welcome Provost Collins.
Thank you so much, Mary. I'm just delighted to be here this afternoon with all of you. And I also wanted to start by thanking the team at NCID for bringing us all together. We've learned that virtual events have their own set of challenges. And so I just really appreciate the thought and the hard work that went into organizing this event and making this gathering possible. Thank you very much to the whole team. I also really look forward to hearing from our distinguished panelists, and you'll hear more about them in a little bit, who bring so much valuable expertise in anti-racism research to our campus and today to our conversation. And honestly, it's great to see in the chat that we're joined by people from not only across campus, but across the country. Welcome, we're delighted to have you with us. So we know that the twin pandemics of the last 2 years have drawn public attention to structural racism with mistreatment by police, disparities in healthcare, economic and employment inequities. Those are some of the particular, but certainly not the only areas of concern. And we also know that racism permeates our society. And as scholars, we recognize the critical importance of work that illuminates this and that contributes to addressing it. This understanding, I believe, is foundational for the multifaceted anti-racism initiative that the university launched in the fall of 2020. A key component of that work is expanding the resources and the infrastructure on our campus to support and to elevate the research and really to recognize and celebrate the scholars who are making such important work move forward and have an impact. And this is an important part of building capacity in this really critical area. For decades, the university has created and led innovative projects that explore race, identity, and their impact in people's lives. One important example is the Program for Research on Black Americans, which was established in 1976, and I think very well known to this audience. In areas from health to education to the arts, Michigan faculty have and continue to develop new approaches to understanding the complexity of racism and its impacts across society. So often we know this work cuts across disciplinary lines, and this is really a key focus of our current anti-racism hiring initiative, which you'll hear a bit more about it at some point later today. The university has long supported collaboration across fields as key to generating new ideas and really getting our arms around very complex topics and developing new perspectives as well. So the Anti-Racism Collaborative is an important part of our efforts to bolster connections among researchers in this area, to forge new partnerships and develop new research questions and move forward to address them. The work you're doing or considering doing and the new directions that it may take after today's discussion are really critical contributions to our understanding of and our ability to address racism. And so again, I want to express my appreciation to those on the panel and all of those across campus and more broadly who are doing this work. But I also want to mention that there are a number of other benefits to this work as well. Research projects are an important training experience for our students, engaging both undergraduates and especially our graduate students. Through their work with faculty, they develop the knowledge and the skills that are essential for carrying anti-racism work forward. And so as part of this, I'm pleased especially to note this year that the collaborative is hosting 2 postdocs, Dominique Adams Santos and Laura Ann Jacobs. So delighted to be able to acknowledge both of them. We welcome the opportunity to learn with them and from them. Welcome. This past summer as well, with support from the Provost Office and Rackham, 21 graduate students received grants from the collaborative to support their own research. That's an investment in the future of anti-racism research, and we're delighted to make that investment. I also want to note the importance of this research for our teaching mission, for teaching and learning. As faculty work on anti-racism is published and discussed in academic circles and beyond, it makes its way into the courses both here and at colleges and universities around the world. And as that happens, students have rich opportunities to learn about how racism impacts all of us and to develop their own responses to it and to develop their own questions and carry on their own research. And so that dynamic is really powerful and, in my view, exciting. Academic research also reaches the public through podcasts, news reports, and a variety of other types of media. And that also contributes in important ways to society's ability to understand and to address racism. So as provost and as a faculty member, I'm really proud to be part of the community that's doing such impactful work, especially at a time when its importance is so clear and action is so critical. So we come together today to learn from our distinguished panelists and moderator, and from one another as well about how we can further anti-racism research and scholarship and learning and teaching, I might add. And so I'm really looking forward to a rich, nuanced conversation. And it's my pleasure to turn the mic over to Dr. Tabby Chavis. Tabby, take it away.
Thank you, Susan. Good afternoon. I'm delighted that you're here to share this discussion and grateful for the support that you've provided for this discussion. There are many ways to work toward eliminating societal racism. Indeed, as Provost Collins noted, there are many such efforts happening on our campus led by our students, staff, faculty, alumni, and campus partners. The Anti-Racism Collaborative, a part of a partnership with the Provost Office, focuses on the work and promise of ways that higher education through research and scholarship can inform and impact positive change. Scholars have continued to play critical roles in developing new innovations and knowledge around the varied and complex mechanisms through which racism impacts our society, and in building and maintaining partnerships with local and national communities to address these issues. In that spirit, I'm proud to welcome today's panelists, our inaugural group of Anti-Racism Collaborative Research and Community Impact Fellows. This exceptional group of scholars are recognized for their skills, competencies, and commitments to meaningfully partnering with communities throughout the research cycle, and for their intentional efforts to use their scholarly work for impact towards more equitable communities and society. Our conversation today, I hope and anticipate, will be an opportunity for us to learn about each of their respective projects that they're currently working on, as well as the community-centered approaches that they each value and employ. I'm confident that our discussion will help illuminate and inform research, practice, community engagement, and other actions to advance anti-racist principles in organizing. And I'm delighted and honored to serve as the moderator for today's discussion and share space with this amazing group. Before we get started, I want to echo Provost Collins' thanks to our collaborative and NCID team for their thoughtful vision and planning for the event, logistical access support, and support of our scholar panel and community. Throughout the event, our team will help share examples of links to some of the terrific work being done by our scholar panelists so that attendees can learn more and take away some valuable resources from the scholars' work along with the rich discussion. With that, I'm pleased to briefly introduce our panelists. Melissa Borja, Assistant Professor of American Culture. Charles Davis III, Assistant Professor of Higher Education. William Bill Lopez, Clinical Assistant Professor of Public Health and Faculty Associate in the Department of Latino Studies. Deborah Rivas Drake, Professor of Psychology, and Stephanie J. Rowley, Professor of Education. Celeste Watkins Hayes, University Diversity and Social Transformation Professor, and Jean E. Fairfax, Collegiate Professor of Public Policy and Professor of Sociology. So, first of all, I want to say, congratulations and thank you for being our inaugural Collaborative Research and Community Impact Fellows. We're so pleased to be able to partner with and support you in your research and scholarship. Thank you all for being here today. I'm excited for this opportunity to not only highlight the exciting work that each of you are doing, but for all of you to connect with and be in conversation with each other. Sometimes amazing people don't have as much opportunity as they would like and deserve to connect with each other, and which we were joking about before this event began. So I'm going to jump right in. I'll ask each of you to describe a current research project that you're leading that advances the principles of anti-racism, and certainly as you define them, and we'll talk about that in a bit later too. But describe something that you're working on with the goal of facilitating systemic change. Is there an aspect of the project that you're particularly excited about in terms of the findings, the approach you're taking, the partnerships or the impacts that you're making? So I'll start with Dr. Borja, or Melissa.
Thank you so much. It is so wonderful to be here. I'm just so grateful for this opportunity to be part of this group. So one thing that my team is working on is studying anti-Asian racism during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm the leader of a big initiative called the Virulent Hate Project. We have been using news media to track incidents of anti-Asian racism reported in news media since the beginning of the pandemic. But one thing I'm really excited about is we don't just pay attention to how Asian Americans have experienced anti-Asian racism. We also are tracking how Asian Americans are responding to it. And this is, I think, a part of the response to anti-Asian racism broadly that has been missing. I have been involved with the organization Stop AAPI Hate, and my team has contributed to projects related to their work. But I think so much of the conversation up until this point has been focused on how Asian Americans have been on the receiving end. What we have seen in the past couple of years is an amazing array of creative responses that reflect a variety of different contexts. So I say this as a Midwesterner who once lived in California and once lived in New York. These are very different places where people are experiencing racism, and also very different places where people are responding. And so what we are doing in the next phase of our work is doing a series of case studies where we're going to study how different types of community organizations in different locations are drawing on the resources locally available to address the problem as it is locally expressed. In addition, we are going to be in the coming months sharing some of the bigger picture findings that we have from news media research about how Asian Americans are responding to anti-Asian racism in near term. And finally, I'd like to point out that this is a problem that's very global, but also very local. So in the long run, I'd love to draw connections between how people in Indiana are responding to this problem and how it might have similarities and differences with people in the Bay Area and in Sydney and in London, because we're seeing people of Asian descent experiencing anti-Asian racism during the pandemic all around the world. And there are a lot of really interesting connections between these efforts to respond to it.
Thank you, Melissa. Next, I'll ask Charles to speak.
Good afternoon, or perhaps morning, depending on where you're joining us from today. Tabby and to the NCID team, thank you so much for bringing us together. Not only, I think, just in the virtue of us being very busy and trying to get so much accomplished and not really able to get to, commune with one another, but for myself as a relatively new faculty member, having not been able to really meet most of you all in person, it's always great that we can come together and talk about our work. And I'm just really excited to be a part of this amazing group and to learn from each of you. So my name is Charles Davis. I'm an assistant professor at the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Ed here at the University of Michigan. And the current project that I'm working on is entitled the Police Free Campus Project. So thankfully, we have an amazing research team through the Campus Abolition Research Lab that's really concerned about the ways in which the Carceral University has a broader impact within the surrounding communities in which many colleges and universities are situated. Of course, many of us know that a almost sort of direct path was taken on by institutions following the murder of George Floyd, understanding the response of the University of Minneapolis with regard to its severing its relationship with local police, and then having sort of these really important questions to raise about what does higher education and college universities in particular have with regard to its own relationship to carceral systems of punishment, to the practices of policing, and in what ways does it create the climate and conditions that render many folks who are on campus, including faculty, staff, and students, but also community members, in a way that they experience the world as a lack of safety despite the presence of law enforcement. And so for us as sort of a collective abolitionist thinkers, we're really trying to interrogate this notion of race sort of conscious and community-centered understandings of safety that really look at everything except law enforcement as a possible solution. We know that strong communities render police obsolete. And so what would it mean to think about higher education as a life-affirming institution, one that doesn't perhaps exacerbate many of the ills that we see within school and society? And so our work is right now taking a three-pronged approach. And so the first approach of that work is a national narrative study, where we're wanting to engage with racially minoritized students, faculty, and staff, and other minoritized groups to understand not just their experiences with the institution of policing, but as I think Melissa talked about really importantly, in what ways are they fighting back or responding to the presence of police on their campus? How are they trying to create different conditions in which police are not necessary to respond to, say, things like mental health and emotional health services calls to actually get survivor-centered care to those who are victims and survivors of campus sexual violence. And so we want to hear from folks, again, from across the country, again, as Melissa mentioned, that these things happen and look differently in different places. People have different types of relationships to the institution of policing or policing practices. So we want to have a better sense of what that looks like nationally, given that there is relatively little understood about that particular phenomenon in college and university context. The second aspect of this, which is really central to our community engaged work, is a digital ethnographic project that we're currently undertaking in Philadelphia. I'm thankful to be on leave to be able to do some research in that area, and so thankful for NCID support through this amazing program to continue to elevate that work. But I think one of the things we're going to get into, right, is what does it mean to be community centered? And for us, thinking about that ethnographically, it means we have to be in community and in relationship with people. And so we're on the ground in Philadelphia, working with a number of campus community organizers from a variety of institutions who are, again, thinking about the sort of effective urban renewal and urban university and how it has created sort of a climate that necessitates police reinforcing the social, the spatial, and symbolic boundaries of campuses that really creates this distance between the town and gown, or this us versus them, right? And as some scholars have talked about, the university as the domain of solutions and society being the domain of problems. And so how are they navigating those boundaries? In what ways has digital and new media been a part of their strategies and tactics, specifically given the limits of our ability to gather in person, right, in the social distance moment? And then our third but important aspect of our work is going to be taking the longitudinal analysis of current campus law enforcement survey data, as well as the campus crime safety survey, because we want to see, really, to the extent that, one, we know that the growth of policing in higher education has outpaced that of student enrollment, but what we're starting to see preliminarily is that it also outpaces and actually speaks against this clear trend over almost 2 decades now of a decline in campus crime and violent crime generally, but yet more and more resources are being dedicated to something rather than the things that, again, that we know that keep students, faculty, and staff safe with regard to services that are really important. So we'll be looking at these 3 areas again and thinking about this work more holistically and sort of big picture, also sort of interrogating this notion of policing and that it can in fact exist and has always existed outside of the formal institution of police, but actually is embodied in our very practices as faculty members in our classrooms, as administrators and service providers with regard to our surveillance of students on campus, and really trying to broaden this conversation around what it means to think about campus abolition in a way that has not just police-free futures, but freer futures for students, faculty, and staff on their campuses.
Thank you. Already I'm seeing like some terrific and interesting connections with kind of the way that you're using kind of regional and national data, as well as the ways that you're thinking about like the experiences and the risk in community responses in different spaces. So other people may be noticing many other interesting things, but I'm going to keep the first question going in terms of something exciting or striking that you want to share about your current projects, and I'll continue in the order that I introduced with Bill Lopez.
Yes, thank you so much, Tabby, and hello to my fellow panelists. It's so great to be here with you all today. Thanks to NCID and the Provost Office for arranging this. The work I'm excited about, that we're putting the most effort into right now, is a project that we call ICE in the Heartlands. And ICE, for those of you who don't know, stands for Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And what we're looking at in this project are the impacts of and responses to large-scale immigration worksite raids. And these are raids in which from 50 to a couple of hundred people are arrested. And just to give you a snapshot of the political background that has provides the context here, these raids happened often during the Bush administration, stopped during the Obama administration, and happened in force during the Trump administration, and have stopped again during the Biden administration. So we have reason to believe, and we're making the argument that these raids are going to be a political flex, as much as the border wall is, depending on the political party in power. But the exciting part of this work, and we're taking notes from Melissa's project here as well, is that we're documenting not only the impacts of these raids, but the ways in which communities respond, right? So we're both trying to understand this system of racialized structural violence that impacts mostly immigrants of color, but also what these communities do across lines of race and across lines of class to respond in the face of this violence. At the moment, I'm currently looking at a data set from teachers, right? So briefly, immigration worksite raids happen during the workday by design. With little exception, we know where children will be during the workday. So without exception, every time these disastrous events happen, it's teachers who are telling the children, the students, that your parents might not pick you up today, right? And I want to bring up that this is why the community-based portion of this work is important. Without being in community with educators, with those who have experienced raids, we would not understand this and be able to translate it for folks who don't understand the impacts of immigration raids. The last piece I'll add is a big part of the work that I believe we do as a group and as part of this fellowship, is translating our work outside of the academic sphere. So what we've done is partnered with La Casa and U of M Latino group, as well as 2 graphic artists who are both Latino and current or former U of M students who have read our work on immigration and the impacts of raids, have translated into graphic art and created a web page to show the impacts of raids along with quotes from these interviews, right? And this is meant to be a visual way to study these impacts for folks who are not, for example, able to access our manuscripts. The next wave of this will be artistry and drawings and graphic arts around responses to these raids. And then the final thing I'll add is in highlighting the innovation and creativity of a largely Latino and underprivileged and immigrant community, the question we continue to ask is, can you imagine what we could create if we were able to spend our creative energy on something other than surviving amid a racist system, right? We always want to push that question further. Amid this racist system, if we didn't live under this kind of racism, what would we be able to use our energy on? So again, I thank you, Tabby, and my fellow panelists for being in community and talking about our projects today, and I look forward to discussing more.
Yeah, I look forward to it too. More to come, and but I will keep it moving, and I will continue with Debbie Rivas-Drake.
Thank you, Tabby. I want to thank NCID, Tabby, as well as Susan for this really critically important initiative. I'm so honored to be in this room with these tremendous scholars, just learning and thinking together. I look forward to that work, and for the support of a project that I'm going to talk a little bit about called Stepping Up Against Racism and Xenophobia, or SPARKS, which is a collaboration with a colleague, Enrique Neblet at the School of Public Health, and our postdoc, fabulous postdoc, Laura Ann Jacobs, as well as a village of graduate students and undergraduate students here at Michigan, and colleagues outside the university, and a still developing advisory group of practitioners and caregivers. And the central goal of SPARKS is, I think there's like a little bit of a recurring theme here, is to provide parents and educators with resources that will help them to work with the kids in their lives from 0 to 17 to help develop anti-racist competencies. So we're kind of focusing on the earlier part of the life course, and really thinking about, the overarching, question for us is really, how can we, there's been a proliferation of resources aimed at parents and educators, especially in the last couple of years. How can we help them make sense of those in a way that is actually useful and that will help them to actually accomplish the things that they seek to accomplish, by way of responding, recognizing, and resisting racism wherever and however it manifests in their lives. We are, I'm happy to say that as of today, we have just completed our 88th interview for a needs assessment of folks, I know, right? It's like, they're from all over the country, lots of, just all over, in rural, urban, suburban regions, just all over. I mean, it's really incredible. I want to thank the team for doing that, and really for their commitment. And, to really understand what are the issues, as Melissa mentioned, in their local context and local experience, the multiplicity of lived experiences that kind of go into, especially for parents, how they think about these issues with their kids, and try to, process for themselves what they're living and or experiencing vicariously, through as just a member of our society, or, actually trying to teach, right, and kind of help cultivate with their kids and in their kids. So we have work that's sort of looking at that, these assessments really looking at their lived experiences and their understanding of the content that is out there. So this is a very different project for me, in that it's very much more action oriented, I would say, in that the motivation for the data collection is really to assess, how can we generate something that is useful and is actionable, given the pressing, what's pressing to parents and educators right now. And and I have so much to say. I think Bill was sort of alluding to this idea of like, so how do you think about that, and what's the, what are the products of that type of work? And this is certainly a new, sort of new direction for me in terms of thinking about, what is a meaningful product of all of this, data collection and this, research endeavor. And part of that, what's been interesting, I think, and exciting is that we're very, very open. I think it's really our next phase is to develop, right, something like a resource hub. That's what we imagined, or a clearinghouse of tools and resources that is informed by this, research, as well as what we know from decades of literature on this topic. And there's lots that we know from the child development and youth development fields. But we are also remaining open, because as we partner and identify partners, to really help challenge, and even that vision, and think about, what it would be more useful, more meaningful. And even as we develop our prototype, we are going to be, looking for that critical feedback and partnership, and even possibly reimagining what our products are going to be. And I think that that's a little bit, we're very vulnerable. I have to admit that I'm much more vulnerable position as a scholar, but yet also very excited and invigorated. And I think the team is as well, to really make sure that what we're doing is impactful, that it's actually reaching who we want to reach and how we want to reach in a way that makes sense to them. So I think I will stop there, because I think there's just a lot that we could all talk about. I'm really excited to have that conversation. And I just want to thank you again for your support and for this conversation.
Thank you, Debbie. And so I saw Celeste nodding around your sentiments, and I will then invite her to share her thoughts about the work that she's working on, and kind of areas that you're particularly excited about, and in relation to this conversation. So Celeste.
Thank you so much, Tabby, and thank you to NCID and Provost Collins and her team. And I first just want to remark on what it means for a major research university like the University of Michigan to put attention, resources, the lens of the provost and the resources of the provost office and the spotlight of the provost office and NCID on such an important topic as anti-racism. And it's really wonderful to see higher ed institutions taking up this question at the macro level, and to recognize our role as potential change makers, and also our role as people who grapple with these questions, as Charles talks about, in terms of what happens within the institutional setting and how are we potentially perpetuating dynamics that we don't want to. So I am Celeste Watkins. I'm a sociologist and a scholar of public policy and African American studies. And I'm the author of a book called Remaking a Life: How Women Living with HIV Confront Inequality. And the overarching thrust of the book was to follow the lives of over 100 women living with HIV in Chicago, women of diverse racial and ethnic and socioeconomic backgrounds. And what we found in interviewing women is this overarching theme of women's movement from dying from to living with to thriving despite. In the best of scenarios, the notion that women, when they were diagnosed with HIV, often interpreted it as a death sentence, and then had to figure out how to move to living with and thriving despite a chronic manageable illness, because HIV is now a chronic manageable illness. But it's really a story about how women navigate inequality, because one of the quotes, the quote that opens the book, is from a woman named Dawn in Chicago, who says, "If it weren't for HIV, I'd probably be dead." And I've told this story often because it is so powerful, and it was a puzzle that I had to understand of why would someone credit HIV/AIDS, an illness responsible for the deaths of over 30 million people around the world, for saving a life. And it really speaks to what William talked about in terms of what does it mean for people to navigate systems of racism. Because what Dawn was saying was, if it weren't for the HIV community, if it weren't for the access to healthcare that I now receive because I'm living with HIV, if it wasn't for the access to community that I have through this community of people living with HIV, if it wasn't for the access to survival resources that I've needed, if it wasn't for the access to mental health resources that I now qualify for, I'd probably be dead. And what we learn is that Dawn and so many people like her living in a context of being under-resourced and underserved in a variety of ways, those have cumulative effects that impact people's physical health, that put them more at risk, that put them at risk for acquiring what I call injuries of inequality, those wounds to our body that are produced by vulnerability and inequity. And HIV is no exception to that in terms of the context of risk that Dawn and many women were navigating was a context of lack of access to healthcare, a context of poverty, often a context of the over policing of their communities and the mass incarceration of their loved ones, and really added up to a context of vulnerability as they navigated the world, and where they were also in communities that were seeing, as a result, higher HIV transmission rates because of the lack of resources. So what Dawn was explaining was this irony that the access to care, the access to resources came through being part of the HIV community, a community that has fought for now 40 years to build an infrastructure to make sure that the most vulnerable among us have access to resources, that pushed for the Ryan White Healthcare Act, that became a harbinger for the Affordable Care Act, that were willing to put their bodies on the line in the demonstrations that we remember seeing in the 1980s and 90s, fighting for healthcare, fighting for medical research that would focus on illnesses disproportionately affecting marginalized communities like LGBTQ communities and Black and Brown communities and low-income communities. So in the telling of Dawn's story and the telling of the stories of many women, I'm able to talk about what it means to die, not just from HIV, but to die from inequality, to die from lack of access, and to be able to get access to a community, a safety net that moves one from living with to even thriving despite. So the common theme that I see with all of the discussions is our discussion of structural racism and the impact that it has on people's lives and how it puts them at increased vulnerability for a whole host of harms. But then we're also pivoting and looking at how are people responding? How are they building activist communities in the case of HIV, such that Dawn feels like it's that activist community that saved my life? How are people fighting for policies? How are people fighting for cultural change to be able to change hearts and minds around these issues? So Remaking a Life focuses on the women, but it situates their story in a larger context of structural violence. And it also talks about how public policy and activism can be really life-changing and life-saving for people who find themselves grappling with injuries of inequality.
Thank you, Celeste. And in the chat, you'll see the team is posting some examples of links to some of the things that our panelists have referenced. Also, just want to remind the audience that you can post questions that will build in some space to infuse into this discussion as well, to kind of the things that are hitting you or resonating with you, or that you want to take advantage of this terrific opportunity to engage with this group of scholars. I'm going to move to a next set of questions, and certainly, you may choose to elaborate or echo one another's perspectives, or you may feel as though one member's perspectives captures yours. So I won't feel put pressure for all 5 people to answer all questions, but you all have very both convergent, but also very diverse lenses on these issues, and that's why you're here. And one of those lenses is on the concept of anti-racism in itself. so as you all know, I mean, certainly as scholars in the spaces that you work in, the term anti-racism is not a new one, but it has been engaged in maybe some new ways over the past year or so, given the societal events that have happened in terms of police violence that sparked or ongoing or new racial reckonings and movements, as well as the inequalities of race that have been either induced or exacerbated by the pandemic. And so, as you might imagine, the concept has been framed and taken up in many ways, and you probably have seen that both nationally and perhaps locally. And there are assumptions or different lenses around what anti-racism means, from individual actions and responsibility to a focus on changing structures and systems. And so I'm going to ask you all, what does engaging in anti-racism research mean to you? And I'm going to start with Charles.
I was really hoping I'd have the benefit of listening to my brilliant colleague before I said anything. But thanks for inviting me to respond to this question. This is always an interesting question for me. I think I actually just got like a request if I could do like an anti-racism workshop, and I was also confused on what might be expected, right, or meant by that, because there's so much we could talk about. And so, for me, it kind of comes in a couple of different iterations. So I'd say first, thinking about sort of the genealogy of the work, right? I mean, I think we kind of came out of a quote unquote sort of DEI focused moment, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's then sort of been wrapped around this conversation around anti-racism, where the A has found its way into an acronym of your choosing, right, at this particular point in time. But really thinking about how different, the sort of era of multiculturalism is from DEI, from anti-racism, and in many ways how they are sort of speaking to and against one another in certain regards, right? That in some regards, things being sufficient is not just because of their necessity, right? Which is to say you could be quote unquote diverse with regard to composition and representation, and yet still not be anti-racist to any extent, right? You could be inclusive and yet not equitable. And so I think part of it is interrogating what we mean by these words, how they are often considered fungible, right, in a certain way. And I think in addition to that, history is knowing that, again, anti-racism isn't new. And so for me, as someone who's trained sort of in like the Black radical tradition and Black studies, I have to think about sort of the era of race women, right, of Anna Julia Cooper, Shirley Graham Du Bois, Vida B. Wells, who were at the forefront, not just of issues related to civil rights with and on behalf of Black people, but also the feminist movement in and of itself. And so I think one thing that's, drawing my close attention is the extent to which even this collaborative, right, this initiative is led by, right, and sort of the thought genius of a number of women of color and Black women in particular, that comes full circle in this particular moment. And so when I think about the notion of anti-racism, for me, it's sort of asking sort of the questions of, not just what we're against, but what are we for, and to what end, right? And then what are we willing to sort of achieve those goals? And so minimally, if we think of racism as a larger sort of system of structural disadvantaged or group differentiated vulnerability to premature death, as Ruth Gilmore would suggest, then we have to think of anti-racism as not singular, right, but multifaceted, that has to address, yes, the interpersonal interactions that happen that are more overt and perhaps more easily identifiable, but also the things that systemically and structurally actually perpet racially inequitable outcomes. Right. And so in my work and interpreting that, part of it is wrestling with this notion of what does it mean to have justice, right? When we think about the issues of policing, of police brutality, of the consistent levels of police violence experienced, not just by Black folks, but Black folks in particular, certainly women of color, trans women, poor and low-income communities, those with mental and emotional health issues and concerns. For me, justice at minimum requires a precondition of life, right? And I think that is something that I'm really sort of trying to understand, is how a police department, for example, could even suggest itself to be anti-racist, to take up the mantle of anti-racism or diversity or equity of inclusion, if the institution fundamentally is about producing these inequitable outcomes and all the things that matter, particularly with regard to life. So for me, I think I really want to push us, collectively in thinking of how is our work situated in these various avenues, but also, what are we trying to accomplish? What is the end here? And it can't be, in my opinion, right, the recreation of some other industrial complex from which, folks of our intellectual bourgeoisie class, if you will, right, as sort of like professors at major research institutions, can consistently and individually benefit from, right? in terms of their own relationship to prestige, to productivity of their scholarship, and to the profit that comes to their labs, to them individually. But in fact, it has to be about people, right? And if we're not sort of centering people and those inequitable outcomes that often get marginalized just as statistics, but actually represent people's lives, then I don't know if we're actually doing the work justice.
Thank you. And if you all have an epiphany or thought, like raise your hand. Otherwise I will call on you. But in that spirit, I'm going to ask Celeste to speak. I mean, certainly like picking up on the theme of justice, Charles, and some of the work that Celeste is doing as the founding director of the Ford School's new Center for Racial Justice. So Celeste, would you mind picking up?
Absolutely, because I think, Charles, you bring up such a good point in terms of justice in the way we think about anti-racism in terms of the right to be able to live, the right to be able to breathe, and to be able to eventually have an opportunity to thrive. And when you boil it down in that way, the idea that that is a controversial notion to people is so disconcerting. But the ways in which it's been politicized and misunderstood and misinterpreted has made it so that people don't recognize that fundamentally that's what anti-racism is about, right? The idea that all of us should be able to live to our fullest potential. And what I would add to that is a conversation around access to resources and power, right? So once we talk about that right to exist, that right to breathe, then to add on to that and layer onto that this notion of, and then how do we exist within systems of resource distribution that overserve and overprivilege certain groups and then underserve and underprivilege other groups, and how can we challenge, dismantle, intervene on those systems so that people have access to the resources that they need in order to thrive. So I love that you grounded it in the Black radical tradition and in, a long kind of trajectory in general of activism that's happened in Black communities and Brown communities and Asian American communities, where we're all thinking about the same thing, the right to be able to breathe, and then the right to be able to have resources and access to resources that will enable that and will enable that thriving. So at the Center for Racial Justice at the Ford School of Public Policy at U of M, we're trying to think about that from a policy perspective. We're trying to think about how can we understand public policy as a facilitator of that access to breath and life and resources, and policy as an underminer, as a thwarter, as a force that has been used very destructively towards those ends. And we're trying to invest in programming and research and community engagement and policy engagement that grapples with those fundamental questions. So I love how you kind of set up the discussion in response to Tabby's question.
Melissa.
The original question, what does anti-racism research mean? To be honest, I think that is the fundamental question of my team's work at this point. We're trying to figure out what people on the ground understand anti-racism work to mean. And some context is really important here. Asian Americans are very internally diverse. We're talking about a group with a wide range of ethnic backgrounds, languages, the most religiously diverse community. It's the most bifurcated in terms of educational attainment and wealth. So you have a lot of different ideas out there in the world about what it means to do anti-racism work. And so I'm very curious as a researcher, finding out what anti-racism means to people and how they put that idea into practice in a wide variety of ways. So I'm trained as a historian, and I'm also a religion scholar. And my team recently did a small study of all of the statements about anti-Asian racism distributed by different Christian denominations over 2020 and 2021. And we found that just even within the specific group of American Christian denominations that decided to say something about anti-Asian racism, there were a wide array of understandings of what it means to experience racism and why it's a problem. Some people described it in terms of white supremacy, others described it in terms of theologies of sin. And these are very different ways of understanding the nature of the problem of racism and in turn, what it means to take meaningful action against racism. So that diverse understanding is very interesting to me as a scholar.
Debbie or Bill, I want to see if you wanted to add or,
I'll jump in. I think I agreed with everything that Charles said. In fact, I think one of the interesting things has been, sort of pivoting in the work that I do, really what is it that we're working toward? And for me, really being explicit and clear about that. And for me, it is about, that, the right to education, the right to opportunity, the right to participation in civic life, starting at birth, like even before birth, just at the very beginning of life, all the way through. And what does that look like and mean? And I think when for young people and for adults in young people's lives to be able to facilitate that. And my work has really, if I think about that question, I have done different types of projects that help to answer that, most of them in schools or in partnership with schools or school district personnel to really understand classroom practices and experiences that facilitate that outcome at the end of the day. And this project, just thinking about what Melissa's saying, I think it is interesting. One of the things we're asking parents and educators is like, what does racial justice mean to you? And what does that look like? I think there is sometimes an assumption that's made, what this, because by whoever is either directing resources or asking the question. And I think we've been very open and we're learning lots of things. I mean, all of the issues that have been raised already are issues that parents have said that they care and they want to understand, and that they actually don't have a full grasp in terms of either policy level or interpersonally in their community. I mean, they don't necessarily know how to broach this and how to act in their local context. A lot of folks do, but a lot of them don't, and they really do want to do better. So I think that this has been very, I think, illuminating, and they want to do that and also with their kids, so that I think they understand that this work is multi-generational and right. And so if they're not intervening now, we are likely to perpetuate the same systems, because just systems don't just manifest. They are, they are cultivated, and we have to teach people how to do do this work and design systems that are designed for different ends, and the ones that we experience and that we perpetuate. And for me, I mean, the question is really, how do you do that right away? I mean, in some ways, with young people, in some ways, we are laying, a little bit of the hope more at their feet, hoping that they will do better. But I think hearing from, again, these parents and educators, I really do feel optimistic that there's a desire to do that, and that there's really a lack of, well, although there's a lot of resources and information out there, that there's not necessarily, a clear understanding of what is the arc that I can go on, what is the trajectory that I need to be on, what is the work that I need to do to be able to do that, either within my own, around issues that my own group is concerned with, my own community, or in coalition. I think this is a really central question for me. It's really, how do you foster cross-racial coalitions and work to be able to advance and really address multiple oppressions that affect all of us. And those are salient issues. And so I'm excited to really think more about what that can look like. And the other piece of this is like the anti-racism research is, so the outcome of this the most important outcome of what we're doing isn't going to be a publication. And I think I can really say that. I feel like totally free to say that as a full professor, and so on. And so I think we need to talk about that. What do we see as the outcomes and what are the products? Like even using the word product, it can be a little bit problematic, of the work that we do.
Thank you. I know I got a signal from Bill that, I will continue. I will pick up the next question with him maybe. And I definitely want to get into the discussion of what does it mean to have research impact and how you assess that. And I think all of you have mentioned something about the ways that impact might be connected to how the communities that we're engaged in and supporting and partnering with and serving, like, define that. A little bit more to come in that space. I guess I want to take up the topic of multiple oppressive systems by also bringing up the concept of intersectionality, which also is not a new concept, like anti-racism. The idea that racism may be interconnected or amplify other oppressive systems such as classism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, among others. In my scholarly area, for example, I entered my work through the lens of racial identity and how that relates to achievement processes that minoritize and devalue Black students. But intersectional kind of frames or processes emerge from that work. For instance, the work that my collaborators and I have done around the ways that Black girls are often situated and compared negatively by teachers against gender ideals for white girls in ways that are different from some of the specific stereotypes or constructions of Black boys, but in ways that undermine their engagement and achievement in some very powerful ways, or similarly how Black girls and women's positive adaptation and resilience can be based in gender and race socialization around their integrated identities in ways that can't be captured by only looking at race or kind of gender socialization lenses. So I kind of entered with a racial lens, but the phenomenon itself could not be kind of considered without considering intersecting systems of oppression that impacted the construction and the experience and the responses of this population. So some of you have alluded to issues of class and race, and I guess I want to take up the concept of intersectionality in the space of anti-racism. First, I'll name in discussions with people across campus. There is not one way of thinking about that. We've heard like, oh, is a focus on many identities taking away from a focus on racism and the unique kinds of challenges of racial oppression. And others argue, as one of my colleagues aptly states that anti-racism can't not be intersectional, and that you can't distinguish them. And so I guess I'm wondering about this concept in terms of what it means to you and how it has fit into your scholarship and work, centrally into the way you approach it. And Bill, if you wouldn't mind kind of starting with that question, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Tabby. That's a great question. So when I was doing the original work, looking at an immigration home raid that happened about 7 miles from where Tabby is sitting, assuming Tabby's sitting at the University of Michigan, I did some ride-alongs with police to see how they enforced immigration law. And after a while, I wondered why they were willing to let me into their cars, right? I was writing about anti-immigration, right? Anti-deportation, but they continued to let me observe what they were doing. And it came to, I began to realize that they saw immigration enforcement and police violence, and they saw Latinos and Black communities, two entirely different topics, right? And of course, this isn't the case. Latino communities also deal with policing. Black communities also deal with immigration enforcement, but there's also Afro-Latinos and others who are at the intersection of most of many of these identities. And speaking of, I think it might have been Debbie's point as well. Thinking about this, drawing cross-racial movement requires us to understand both the differences, but also where those identities intersect, right? Where are these experiences of policing and immigration enforcement that intersect in all of our communities? And just to give some examples, I studied an immigration home raid, but home raids were perfected in Black communities during war on drug uses of SWAT teams, right? We saw Border Patrol drones used to monitor protesters in DC after George Floyd's killing, right? So the resources are being used to monitor all of our communities at the same time. And the last thing that I'll say is I appreciate, one of the things I've kind of wrestled with is in the academy, we often consider our own identity and the differences within our communities and our intersectional identities. And then I see the structures, the racist institutions homogenize us as much as they possibly can, right? Those are all people of color, and they don't care if I'm Latino or, you know, if I identify as Honduran or Mexican or anything else. We all get homogenized and we all get treated similarly, right, in these systems of racial oppression. So what I've wrestled with is how in many of our groups, we do work on articulating our differences and our strengths, and in other ways, we have to fight the systems that gain by homogenizing us.
Other comments or thoughts about that?
I think about that in the context of my work on the HIV community and HIV activism, because it's a community that grapples with this question of in what ways do we get homogenized? In what ways do we find unification helpful? And then within that, how do we honor the specificities within? And it requires us to ask some tough questions about who gets tapped to be the spokespeople, or the folks who get to lead out in front, who are seen as the more kind of legitimate in terms of leading a cause or leading an organization, or doing that kind of brokering to get access to resources for the group. And I think that part of our efforts are also well served by looking at that and figuring out how people grapple with that, and how ultimately they find a way forward that serves the larger aims around justice and equity and access. And I think that's a really ripe and fertile research ground as well. There's obviously scholars who look at those kinds of things, but it's something that I think can be lifted up even more in terms of that distinction between homogenization and community coalition building. And what is it about the special sauce that makes it coalition building versus homogenization? So, and also when I think about intersectionality, which also has a very long and rich intellectual tradition, I always think about the fact that intersectionality has both a scholarly root, but also an activist root as well. So what I love about the notion of intersectionality is that activists are using it and thinking about it, and it's part of the tradition, just like it's part of the scholarly tradition. And I think that there's real power there in thinking about more concepts that can travel, making sure that the concepts stay clear in their meaning, or that we're doing the research to ask people how they understand these concepts. But our greatest ability as scholars, I think, is to think about those terms and those concepts that can travel and that can be tools for people as they assert themselves and fight for equity and justice.
I'm going to infuse a question from the audience around the term. So since we're talking about kind of these terms and these lenses, so you won't see, if you were looking at the Anti-Racism Collaborative site, a single definition of anti-racism. And I think that was a part of the question, is there a universally agreed upon? I think just by the discussion that we just started having, like, the answer is no. And I will say we had community group sessions with different sets of scholars where a few were like, wait, there needs to be one, we need to come up with one definition. And others were like, no, like, that's not important to have, multiple definitions. In fact, like, what would that be? Like, I don't think about it the same way. And kind of the idea came about, which is really illustrated by your discussion so far, is that there could be different ways of thinking about it from an activism perspective, from a scholarly perspective, But it's really important to be precise, to bring precision in what you mean in engaging the work and what aspects of your work, are bringing in like theoretical lenses around the ways that we think about these issues. What are ways that we think about anti-racism in the actual practice or organizing around the work? And so your examples and the different types of work that you do so far illustrate, that there probably wouldn't be an easy or even desirable way for everyone to have one single way of thinking about or working on it. But you are all each able to name very intentionally the ways that you think about those issues and how it's actually infused in different aspects of your work. So I want to get into that a bit more because of a part of like your honor as a research and community impact fellow is around the ways that you're thinking about and intentionally using your research and scholarship towards structural and systemic change. And when I say use your research and scholarship, that means like the work that you're actually producing in your inquiries, but also your positionality as a scholar and the resources of the academy. And I want to get a sense of what this means to you and how do you do it in your work, using your research and your position as a researcher towards systemic change. I'll see who has moved first before I do the call on. I see Melissa smiling, so I'm gonna like.
I'm generally a smiler, so I think I set myself up for that. I often say that the reason I do this work is that we can't change the world until we understand the world. And I see a lot of sort of passion and commitment all around me to make the world better, but I often feel like I don't, as someone who also wants to make the world better, don't have a clear understanding of the nature of the problem. And so I think that as a scholar, I think that is just a very fundamental mission, is helping us understand the precise nature of the problem as it's lived by people in the community. I'll just give one example of how this has animated my work on anti-Asian racism during COVID. There is a lot of obsession among Asian Americans with hate crimes right now. And a lot of politicians are really obsessed with this topic for good reason. Hate crimes are obviously very terrible, but I think what is missing from a lot of the conversation about anti-Asian racism in the current moment is the fact that it takes a lot of different forms. It affects a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. And without taking this step of equating different types of incidents, I do think it really is important for us to know that anti-Asian racism is expressed in bullying that children experience. 1 in 4 Asian American youth has experienced bullying during the pandemic. And 50% of the time, an adult was around and was not intervening in the problem. Like, that's striking to me as a mother, as a community member. And obviously we need to pay attention to striking acts of violence. But I think what's important to me is to help my community understand all of the different ways that Asian Americans have been experiencing racism, but also all of the different ways that people have been responding. So I just want to keep pivoting back to this aspect of our shared work, which is understanding the multiplicity of ways that people have found to creatively address this problem in their own local contexts.
Yeah, I'll pick up from Melissa there if I can, because I think it's such an important point, right? So I think one, we can't have selected outrage, right? And I think that's part of the sort of sensationalization of the moment, as media is a huge component of that, which, sort of just gets to become the arbiter of what's worthy of our concern, right? And part of that sensationalization then renders all of the ways that the sort of everyday, right, the mundane, the quotidian sort of enactments of racism, and even speaking to Celeste's work with regard to how policy informs and dictates in some ways the boundaries by which one can engage in that work, whether we're thinking more contemporarily about, sort of the CRT conversation nationally at the same time that anti-racism, that's like, largest sort of public notoriety, and I think that to me is what's critically important, that we don't forget that there are so many things that have to happen before sort of the overt sort of extreme version of something happens, right? We can think about Charlottesville as an iteration where almost anytime I've given a talk and brought up Charlottesville, everyone says that they were outraged about what happened. And yet we don't think about, well, how does a protest like this specific thing, right, get permitted? How are folks able to walk through an entire campus that has a large campus police force and yet never be stopped? And their first altercation is actually with Black student activists, right, in the quad. And then even more so, how is it possible that so many different acts of violence could happen at that sort of occasion, almost in some ways that we're seeing at January 6th, right, of like people selectively being targeted and singled out, even though we know there's a large systemic problem. And so I think part of it is we have to recognize and understand and sort of bring to the light, right, this sort of everydayness that doesn't normalize the conditions under which racist things happen. And I think in addition to that, for us, we have to be willing, and I appreciate, Debbie, your point of, what does it mean to be a full professor in this moment, to talk about publications and productivity in a certain way. But I think, as a sort of younger generation of scholar, how we have to be honest, open, and willing to have the, I don't know, maybe epistemological, but professional courage, right, to do the things that do matter to the communities from which many of us come from, right? And so for me, I think about the types of analyses that we offer, right? And I think it's so customary to think about anti-racism, of intersectionality, even CRT, to the extent that it exists in an intellectual domain, but it has always existed in the public domain first, and that we can't intellectualize the pain and suffering of everyday people, right? And part of it, as Brian Stevenson would sort of argue, is that we have to be proximal. And I think that's one of the things with many folks that are in the academy that look like us, and sort of show up in the ways that we show up from a compositional standpoint, but don't share the same politics, right? This notion that all skin folk ain't kinfolk. And so when we think about that, for me, it's saying, well, what do I have to offer that isn't just in service to what will advance the university, that will not advance my sort of own professional standing, right? That actually will have some sort of level of consequence, right? Or producing scholarship of consequence that not only articulates, right, from the undercommons, what is actually happening, how people are interpreting and understanding that, but using our positions and our platforms such as these, right, to bring those things not to sort of this public who we assume doesn't know anything, but in fact to the people who have denied and refused to listen to this public for so long. And I think that for me is what's critical about doing this work, is being proximal to those communities in a very real and material way, but also being willing to speak back to power if you're in a position to do so. Because I think that for me is also pushing against this notion, and Dr. Reverend Jamie Washington talks about this, that for many marginalized folks, what we often do is we operate out of the pain of our marginalization, but simultaneously out of the power of our positions of privilege. But we don't often take account, right, for that sort of space. And so we have all talked about our own marginality within the academy in so many different ways. And I think within this group, it might be different, but I know a lot of our colleagues don't take into account that you are still in a very privileged position by comparison to people in your immediate family, right? People into even the communities in which you live. We can think about the pandemic and the level of job security for many of us within this process to still even be here when so many folks who work at our institution, right, are no longer here for any number of reasons. And I think that is an important stock taking for marginalized scholars in particular, is that yes, we can be both marginal and be powered and privileged in certain ways, almost in a similar fashion, thinking about intersectionality, right? That the late Bell Hooks would sort of make clear. For myself as a Black man, I have to understand that I can be both the doer of harm, right, and the receiver of harm. But in order for me to actually do what's sort of expected of me in this position, not only can I account for it, I need to do something that works against that particular trend. And so the last thing I'll say about that in part is, although we may all be working for the end of fighting white supremacy in a very specific and particular way, right, thinking about it as the sort of the banner under which racism functions to advance white hegemonic power, we must also then take into account inside of our communities who we're speaking to about how these other systems of oppression operate. So my work primarily for anti-racism can't just be about fighting white supremacy, right? It has to be fighting misogyny and patriarchy and homophobia and engaging in that work inside of the Black community, because I know that any level of solidarity that we are trying to generate as Black folks, right, will be mediated and ultimately be destroyed by our inability to deal with the tensions, right, and the harm that's caused by these other systems of oppression that operate within us on a regular basis.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on a thread there because it also relates to a few of the questions that have come in from the audience around that touch upon there a few kind of threads related to understanding these multiple oppressive systems, as well as coalitions amongst multiple oppressed groups and identity groups. I think earlier in the conversation, some of you alluded to like thinking about, inter-ethnic group, coalitions and potential discrimination or racism, coalitions across multiple types of marginalization. So would one of you like to start or add to the discussion of the ways that your work has taken up and maybe even some successful examples of strides that you feel that you've made in the context of intergroup kind of coalitions?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, Tabby. That's a great question, and one I think we've had a lot of success with. So, largely, as you all described, much of this is also teaching about what we're learning, or teaching about anti-racism, right, and working with students. And students have really been lots of the lifeblood in the work we're doing. And I kind of came into this work from this immigration and deportation lens, right, and have since worked with people who are much more aware of policing violence, but also of Islamophobia. And many of the ways in which we've divided this is folks have taught me, especially when thinking about Islamophobia following 9/11, of all the surveillance that happens, right? And so, and folks from this community and Latino community and Black community have all started sharing the stories of actually when their homes were raided. And this has happened in a number of settings where people started to describe, all the surveillance that we believe was only attached to Islamophobia is really attached to the surveilling of the Black community as well. Or the way that you were targeted for being undocumented, which isn't really visible through a car window, but they pulled you over anyway because of your race, is exactly the way it played out over here because I had a hijab on, even though that's not necessarily a marker of my race in a way that my Black skin was, right? So what's been happening is folks are coming together to see how these techniques are used across communities, but at the same time, activist tools used in one circle, we similarly are able to see passed on, with my favorite example being the way that the queer community has come out of the closet and largely informed and taught the undocumented community to come out about their undocumented identity. And most of the folks, or many of the folks who started doing that, were in fact both, right, LGBTQ undocumented folks. But this was a great example of one activist technique that's moved on to another and that's built a better movement because of it.
And it also speaks to the importance of intersectionality, because the way that often travels, those techniques and the sharing of experiences, is from the people who have multiple marginalized identities. So who are both and in the community. So in my work on AIDS activism, it's the queer folk of color who can speak to the experiences of racism and homophobia, transphobia, et cetera, and speak and bridge the divides across communities to talk about the common themes and to share information across those communities. So it becomes kind of intersectionality in action in terms of people's multiple statuses, helping them to see and helping them to be a bridge between communities that in fact have a lot in common and often don't recognize it until people point out those similarities.
Thank you for that lens. We could spend time with each of you on each of these questions all day. I'm gonna they are connected, these questions, and some of you are pre-answering questions before I ask them, so that's even better. But I want to pick up on, I'm going to ask you to kind of deconstruct your own secret sauce for a moment, and what that really means is, in doing this work and doing it well, it's, awareness and good intentions is not enough. Each of you have intentionally built and cultivated and reflected on self in ways that allow you to bring excellence to this work. And and Debbie, you mentioned earlier, like, oh, this kind of new direction is pushing you out of the comfort zone, maybe of a more traditional way of working on, scholarly impact as traditionally defined by the academy. So I guess I want to get a sense from you, based on either what you're doing or what you have learned, what are the orientations, skill sets, and competencies that you have found are necessary to doing research in engagement and partnership with communities well? As we think about your team, as we think about the emergent scholars who are on this call, as we think about the broader community, Yeah, what are the broader kind of principles around the skills and orientations that you have found valuable or invaluable to this work?
I'll just start by saying that I think the number one skill is humility. And really because, and it's multi-layered in my, again, from my perspective, because there's obviously a humility that is necessary when working in partnership, right, with people outside of the academy. But there's also, I think, this kind of like an internalized, something that's internalized in when you're in the academy. And if you haven't unpacked it, or if you haven't necessarily like done the work to kind of, get rid of yourself of it, that the metrics that we use like are somehow like that our worth as scholars, and our even potentially for some folks like self-worth. I know this is true for students. A lot of times I've had these conversations, that these metrics around, production are like reflective of your worth, either as a person or as a scholar. And I think that that idea of like what is considered prestigious, like kind of taking a step back from that and like really unpacking that, like why is that? And I wanted to say that I really feel like it's in our, even the generation who has benefited from the system the way it is, and within like and followed, right, the norms, and it hasn't necessarily pushed back, that I think we have a large responsibility in changing, right, like how we value a lot of this type of work. We know that faculty of color tend to be more engaged in community or community oriented partnered research, that they tend to do more service that, towards as part of their kind of scholarship, to just engage in service with communities. And that there's not really a place that appears in our system of rewards and recognition in a formal way, and in our evaluation for tenure and promotion. And that's something that I really care about a lot. So I think that like it has also made me have to sort of step back and say, like, even though I have succeeded in the system as it is, how can I still think about changing it so that it's more open and more, kind of there is more space, for scholars to do this type of work, to not feel that this isn't a place that they can do it, and this type of institution isn't a place that they can be that type of scholar, this type of scholar that we are recognizing today. And I want to say that, there are organizations that are interested in this type of thinking and this type of work, and I have been fortunate enough to be funded by the WT Grant Foundation to not only on my scholarly side, my scholarship, my research, but also to think about how do we think about this type of work from the perspective of systems, and really again, systems of reward and recognition, and through our mentorship systems, and how what messages we reinforce when we're mentoring junior scholars and early career scholars, in terms of what's viable, in terms of how they can do the work, and whether they can do the work at institutions like ours. And they care a lot about mentoring, so it's something that they support. And this idea is something that I work on with a student, Bernadette, that I want to just name her really important work that she does. It's also community partnered engaged, and it's really, again, the humility factor of like learning even from the generations like of students that I work with, or earlier career scholars, that what is going to keep you in the academy isn't necessarily like what I, experienced, and that we want them to stay. We want them here. We really, really desperately need you to be here and stay and do the work that you do here. And how can I be a facilitator of that? So I've been thinking about that at all levels. Like, I think this type of work is really hard to do. It takes longer. All the things that people have expressed, it actually requires a lot of resources. And so the fact that we are, sort of doing that by supporting this group, through this initiative, through this program, and then just many other ways that we have been promoting this type of work at the institution, I'm really proud of. And I think it's a really important step in the direction of including this type of work, and keeping it here, and making us sort of a beacon of how we can do that work in ways that are authentic and that are reflected in the panel today.
Thank you, Debbie. You, in the interest of time too, I think you already kind of connected to one of our kind of wrapping up questions, which is what does it take from an institutional support perspective to do this work? And so you mentioned the kind of ways that, impact and prestige are defined. You talked about the resources. Just to get a quick kind of temperature gauge from the group, are there other elements or conditions that are necessary to support the kind of work that you're describing, and to support it being done well and supported from a resource and from a affirmation perspective?
I love hearing how many of our projects understood audience to be not just our colleagues, understood audience and understand audience to be, yes, colleagues, but also community, but also policymakers, but also et cetera. So, and in that multifaceted understanding of audience, and I think that's one of the hallmarks of community engaged research, to think about how the outputs therefore have to meet the interest of the audience. So whether it's writing a book in a more accessible way that is jargon free, which is what I really fought for in my writing, to the website creation that you've heard about, to going out. And I know all of us, when you get a call from a community organization to speak, to present, we're there, right? We go and do that, that conversation with the community organization, because we know that we see that as audience. Even if it's not going to translate into huge prestige, it's going to translate into the value that we place on the work that we do. And what I appreciate and what I hope continues is that the Academy is slowly but surely learning to embrace that as not a side thing that you're off doing by yourself, but just make sure that you've got those markers for tenure that we all care about, but to look more holistically and all encompassing. And Deborah's talked to the fact that takes work to move the needle in that way, so that appreciation of a multifaceted audience can come into the evaluative space in the Academy. So one of the things that I just loved hearing about is all of the different ways that we're talking to our audiences, whether it's websites or podcasts or community speaking events. It's not just journal articles and books written for our peers.
Thank you. I'm going to move us toward the wrapping up, but I'm going to end with one of my favorite questions, because another thing that people who don't know you might not know about you, but I'm going to say it, is that all of you are amazing mentors to students in bringing, engaging, partnering, collaborating, elevating, amplifying. And there's a question that says, what are ways that the ordinary undergraduate student can help support the work that you are doing? So I'm gonna let that be the last question before I move us to the closing. One is look you all up is one of them, but if you have others, if you have specific thoughts about student involvement, please, ping.
I have lots of thoughts about this, and I will say that I saw one of my undergraduate research team members ask a question in the discussion. So I see you, Tiffany. Tiffany is now a grad student, began as an undergrad. Just a backstory. On Sunday, I turned in my book manuscript, okay? I'm untenured. I turned in my book manuscript. I've been working on it for 2 decades. I began it as a 19-year-old when I was a sophomore in college, and I've been working on it, I'm not joking, for two decades. I'm turning 39 this year. So I am acutely aware of the power of mentorship to transform a life and create a career that can have an impact on a community. I'm so grateful for someone who said, Melissa, you should take that idea and run with it. So my research team has comprised 15 to 20 different undergrads from all across the country, from the University of Washington to here at the University of Michigan. That has been the greatest joy of doing this work, is knowing that we're producing a scholarship, but in the process, I am raising up the next generation of scholars who care about producing knowledge to make the world better and giving them skills and an orientation towards this type of work that is rooted in a commitment to courageously telling the truth to the world that needs to hear it. So I've just been really grateful about that aspect. And that to me has been the greatest blessing of this work.
Thank you. And I'm going to let your comments speak. The group one way is to contact these faculty, because and I would say that not just these, but other faculty who are doing that work. One of the joys, our greatest joys, is often working with our students and as collaborators, and as a source of inspiration and as an investment in the future, knowledge and action and impact. So please do reach out. I'm going to close us out. And in doing so, I just want to highlight that we have other events happening on February 18th. We're going to highlight anti-racism scholars in a virtual discussion of the exclusion of Black voices in the arts and emancipatory actions to support reconciliation. On February 24th, we'll be in partnership with the Ginsberg Center around how scholars can center social and racial justice in community engagement and the scholarship of community engagement. Be sure to look at our listserv for more information and look at our events page. I want to thank the panelists. Each of you provided wisdom and nuggets, and wish there was more opportunity for you to connect with each other, and we will create it. Starting in March, each of these panelists, because we could have each delved into their work more deeply, we are going to do that. And so in March, we're going to have start sessions where each of the panelists will lead a session that delves more deeply into their work. So please stay tuned for those announcements. Thank you again to the NCID team for the support. Please join us if you feel free to participate in a post-event survey to let us know the kinds of things that you'd like to know more about. And to conclude today's discussion, since I'm moving us past our time, I'm going to pass the virtual mic back to Provost Collins, who will close us out.
Great, thank you so much. We are over time, unfortunately, but this has been such a wonderful, rich conversation. I'll just very briefly, again, thank Tabby and NCID and the Anti-Racism Collaborative. I think it's really valuable to provide infrastructure and support for the scholars across our campus who are doing this work. And just a really sincere thank you to each of you, both for sharing your projects, and what a pleasure it is to highlight some of the important work that you're doing, but also valuable, much appreciated to hear the wide-ranging discussion and perspectives on why you do this work and the ways that you would like it to have an impact, and things that we should all be thinking about together and discussing and finding ways to move forward. So just a congratulations and a thank you. There's so many things that one could follow up on, and I look forward to having across our campus really productive ways to do that. And so thank you to all, and onward.